We're about a month into Donald Trump's second administration. A lot has happened in that period, but there's also a lot that hasn't happened yet. I'm talking mainly about tariffs. The president spent a lot of time during his campaign talking about trade restrictions. He was going to impose tariffs of 60% or was it 100% on Chinese imports. He was going to impose a blanket levy on all goods arriving in the United States, regardless of where they came from. And since taking office, he has issued a blizzard of executive orders about tariffs. He promised 25% tariffs on Mexico and Canada, promised tariffs on steel and aluminium. He has promised to slap what he called fair and reciprocal tariffs on any country that tilts the playing field against the United States, and so on. But not all of these measures have actually happened yet. In fact, the only tariff that's been implemented, as far as I can tell, is an extra 10% on Chinese imports. So how should we think about the early skirmishes in Trump's latest trade war? Is this the beginning of a broad conflict or a series of threats which may never be realized? What is the Trump administration trying to achieve? How are other countries responding? And how is all the noise about tariffs affecting businesses and consumers? These are the questions we're going to tackle in this week's episode of The Big View. It's what we do at Reuters Breaking Views. We tap our best sources around the world to tackle the biggest questions in economics, business, and finance. I'm your host, Peter Thalarsson. To explore all of this, I'm delighted to welcome Sam Lowe onto the show. Sam is a partner at Flit Global, the business advisory firm, where he leads the trade and market access practice and advises clients on trade policy, removing barriers to trade and managing supply chain risk. He's also a visiting senior research fellow at the Policy Institute at King's College London. And before that, he was a senior research fellow at the Centre for European Reform. He also writes an entertaining and informative Substack newsletter on trade called Most Favoured Nation. Sam Lowe, welcome to The Big View.
Hello, glad to be here.
So Sam, there's so much to talk about, but I think maybe for starters, given the blizzard of news and announcements that we've had so far, it would be helpful for our listeners maybe to recap where we are in what appears to be still something of a phony trade war. So what's actually been imposed versus what's been announced and threatened?
Let's start with announced and threatened, and then we can narrow it down to actually what's in force. So since the beginning of the year, we've had a 25% tariff threatened on Mexico and Canada, along with a 10% tariff on China, which, I won't spoil the end, is the one that is actually in force at the moment. We've also had the proposed new tariffs on steel and aluminium, so that's a 25% tariff on each. And then we've also had the America First Trade Policy Review, which is looking at lots of different issues relating to whether foreign countries are taking advantage of the US via running persistent trade surpluses or other types of issues, including tax. And then we've also had the threat of reciprocal tariffs. The tariffs that are in force are the 10% tariffs, additional tariffs on China, which are on top of a load of existing tariffs that were inherited from the Biden administration. In terms of deadlines, we're going to find out about the Canada and Mexico tariffs by March 4th. In terms of the steel and aluminium tariffs, the deadline for those being brought into effect is March the 12th. And then, yes, we have the 1st of April deadline for the America First Trade Policy Review. So at the moment, there's been more talk than tariffs in effect, but a few further interventions are sort of coming down the line quite shortly.
Yeah. So what would you say at this? I mean, you obviously have observed this for a while, and you observed it pretty closely during the first Trump administration. What have we learned so far about his approach? How is this similar and how is it different from the first time around?
So if we start with the differences, it is much more expansive in terms of application, insofar as under the first Trump administration, we were largely just talking about steel and aluminium tariffs in respect of countries that weren't China. In terms of China, there were other products that were impacted, but it was steel and aluminium plus China-specific issues. This time around, the scope of intervention is much broader insofar as he's proposing, in the case of Canada and Mexico, tariffs on everything. He's also, in terms of the justifications for tariffs, expanded the remit of what he considers unfair practices. So he's moved beyond just saying that other countries, for example, sort of treat the US unfairly because they apply a higher tariff to the US than the US does in return. He's also started mentioning VAT treatment, for example, or broader regulatory
subsidies
concerns,
and things like that. Yeah,
subsidies. Yeah. So as well as he's mentioned subsidies, but I think in essence, particularly with the recent intervention around this idea of reciprocal tariffs, he said to the administration, to USTR, look around the world and find examples of where the US and US companies are not being treated fairly, or where countries are selling more to us than they're buying from us, and put a number on it, and present to me a sort of tariff equivalent I can use to threaten those countries. But I think the important point I would make is that there is some structure to all of this. I sort of put it into three different buckets, where you do have, and we should mention it straight up, the first bucket is random grievances. And these are tariffs that Trump threatens in response to an intervention by a foreign politician, someone doing something he doesn't like. Mm-hmm. So the example of this that we've seen so far is in relation to Colombia and some of the issues relating to sort of accepting citizens back into the country.
The famous 5-hour trade war.
The 5-hour trade war, exactly. So the Colombian president said something he didn't like or did something he didn't like. He threatened him with tariffs, and then they sort of backed down, and depending on how you read the situation, the US won or lost, but victory was claimed none the same. And the important thing to say about random grievances is, of course, you can't in advance predict which countries that's going to apply to. You can't necessarily predict the timing, but you can predict that it will happen. that there will be random grievances and tariffs will be threatened. And also, if you're a policymaker in another government, you can also go out of your way to avoid ending up in that bucket. So you can decide to not publicly criticize Donald Trump or the administration for some of the actions he's taking. And you're seeing this play out across Europe, where that's definitely the approach of the UK government. Every time they're asked about Trump, they sort of either say, oh, he's doing a great job on this one little specific thing, or they don't say anything. But also, to an extent, in the EU as well. The second bucket of interventions are what I think of as the long-term structural concerns. So these are tariffs or other restrictions that Trump is considering based on long-running issues he's had with the way the world works. So this could be countries that run persistent trade surpluses with the US. It could be countries that are applying fines to US companies, which he would view as unfair, or countries that have lots of regulatory barriers preventing the US from exporting. I mean, one of the lists on a list of examples the White House recently published, they pointed out that the EU wasn't buying enough shrimp from the US because of regulatory measures. Which you could say was a bit shellfish. I'm joking, but those sorts of issues, and this bucket is sort of all linked to this 1st of April trade policy, America First trade policy review, and you can actually get ahead of this. I mean, across a load of different metrics, you can kind of work out which countries are more exposed than not. So, for example, if he's worried about countries that run a persistent trade surplus, so look over a 3-year period which countries are running a persistent trade surplus, and at the top of the list you have countries such as Vietnam. Mm-hmm. China is fairly high up there. You have Malaysia. You have some interesting European countries such as Slovakia. Mm-hmm. Because it's a car exporter. So you can sort of say, well, they're going to be quite high up the list. Ireland. And you sort of think, okay, so if he's really focusing on that issue, they're going to be in the crosshairs. And then I think the third bucket, and this is maybe a bit more of a new one because it wasn't so prevalent in the first Trump administration, are tariffs linked to unilateral universal measures. So, for example, he's talked about increasing tariffs by 10%. And I in my head, I sort of link these to revenue raising. It's the idea that tariffs can actually generate income for the state. And in this bucket, you would put a universal 10% tariff uplift, or, for example, the universal uplift on steel. or a universal uplift in tariffs on cars, or a universal uplift in tariffs on pharmaceuticals. And the point I'd make, of course, is that everyone is affected by this bucket. Insofar as you could be the country with the best relationship on earth with the US, but in the first instance, if he decides to universally increase all tariffs on a given product, it affects you and you're going to have to negotiate your way out. But given there are these three buckets, I think you can then look at which countries are more exposed than others. I mean, so to use a sort of parochial example, you can tell from my accent that I'm sitting in London. The UK is in about 1.5 buckets, insofar as it's impacted at the moment by universal tariffs, and it also does some things on the regulatory side and some things on the taxation side that put it in bucket 2, which is the sort of structural concerns. So, for example, it has a digital services tax. The EU is in all three buckets, insofar as it runs a trade surplus with the US and has done for a while. It has lots of different taxes the US doesn't like. It keeps fining American companies. It's impacted by the universal tariffs, and Trump just doesn't like the EU and also wants to take Greenland off one of its member states. So on that basis, you can sort of work out, no one's safe, but some countries are maybe a bit safer than others or have a bit more scope for negotiating exemptions.
But then that's a really interesting way to think about it. But I guess if I contrast that to the way people talked about this the last time, and even in the campaign running up to the election in November, it was the objectives were much more narrow, I felt. Right? I mean they're still incredibly broad, but but people basically talked about this as partly the trade surpluses that you were talking about, and Trump has been very consistent about this for a long time, even before he got into politics, that running a trade deficit with the country is akin to having that country stealing from you and so forth. So that was sort of one objective people thought about. And then more recently, there was this idea that you could use tariffs to raise revenue and that would then allow you to cut taxes and so forth. But it feels like actually when you look at those things, what we're talking about now is a much broader palette of issues, right? I mean, you're mentioning taxes, you're mentioning regulation, you're mentioning, kind of other things that he might not like, or even like territorial objectives. So I guess sort of from the perspective of when the people you're advising or kind of looking at, talking to, how do you sort of make sense of this? I mean, because it feels like it's not really clear what they're trying to get out of it.
I suppose because this then brings us to the question of, okay, so everyone's exposed to some degree or other. So what do you do about it? And it's still the case that in lots of instances, maybe not all, there's going to be a negotiation route whereby, as a country or a company or a product, even a product category, you might be able to talk your way out of these tariffs. But coming to sort of the crux of your question, yes, he has expanded the scope, and I think you can get caught up in sort of saying, well, why is he talking about VAT now? Why is he suddenly talking about these different regulations? He's talking about putting a tariff price on this. Why is he doing this? What's it going to be? It's so confusing. I think if you take a step back, you can just see, well, he wants leverage over everyone. So the problem from his perspective of just focusing on tariffs is that if you are looking at respective tariff levels, some countries such as, say, the EU or the UK actually on aggregate impose very low tariffs on US goods. There are tariff spikes, for example, on automobiles where you have a 10% tariff, or on food products where it goes up, but it's quite low. So actually, just focusing on tariffs doesn't give you much leverage. If you factor in VAT, it essentially allows Trump to threaten at least a 20% tariff against whoever he wants. And from a leverage perspective, if you think that he is trying to extract concessions, well, or he would, if he can extract concessions, great. If it just results in a tariff, also great. It does give him a bit more to play with. So following these reviews, he'll be in a position where he can essentially look at any country in the world and provide some justification outlining why he's threatening them with a 20% plus tariff, and then those countries have to respond. They have to think, well, what am I going to offer up in advance? We've already seen India offering unilateral tariff reductions to try and placate him. Maros Sefcovic, the EU Trade Commissioner, will be speaking to him about what the EU could do, and the talk there is offering up unilateral reductions of tariffs possibly on cars, which would be an interesting route to take, but also promising to purchase more gas, purchase more defense equipment. Because I think I like sort of the different categories, but there's sort of three categories of things you can offer Trump. You can offer to buy more things.
Mm-hmm.
You can offer to join him in his endeavors, by which I mean possibly imposing new tariffs on China or supporting his approach in Ukraine or the like, and you can flatter him. One of the options that some countries can do is, for example, the Australians last time round often talk about managing to talk their way out of some tariffs by getting a famous golfer to write a letter to him, telling him how great he is. The UK version of this is you invite him to see the king. So Macron invited him to the reopening of Notre Dame. These softer type of approaches also can bear fruit.
So there's a lot of stuff there which I really want to come back to, the leverage and how other countries are responding. But just before we do that, quickly, I mean, we've talked about this so far as being this is all Trump, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, to what extent do you think? I mean, as far as we can tell from the outside, to what extent is this different factions in the administration with different objectives? Are there people who really? I mean, we know there are some fairly committed trade warriors who are in and around the administration who want to deal with the trade deficit. We know there are some other people. Obviously, the tech companies which have aligned themselves very publicly with Trump are worried about EU regulation and fines. I mean, to what extent should we think about this as sort of a series of different interest groups or people whispering in his ear and trying to get some sort of progress for their agenda?
We're going to have to see how it plays out. So on this point, one of the big questions for me is how much does Trump simply just want firms to move production into the US and sell to US citizens from there, irrespective of their ownership, versus how concerned is he actually about the national security risks associated with China? Because, for example, would he be happy if a large Chinese OEM car maker said, "I'm going to set up a huge plant in a red state, and I'm going to invest millions, and in return, I want you to let us off some of the new national security related restrictions linked to connected vehicles"? What's his answer on that versus some of the people in his administration who are much more worried about the national security risk posed by China, of which there is actually quite broader consensus spanning party lines? And I think we're going to have to test that and see how it plays out. We've obviously already seen this in relation to a very large social media platform and the restrictions there. Because my sense, and this is just my sense, is that Trump is much more concerned about the idea that China is taking jobs from the US than he is that China is a national security risk to the US. And actually, he'd actually be quite excited about some large Chinese companies promising to invest billions into the US, and that might not be shared by everyone around him.
Yes, so we just have to sort of read the runes a bit and see what comes out.
And last time, it sort of ebbed and flowed. Who he was listening to at any given moment did change. Yeah. Over time, you had sort of flavors of the month who were sort of then unceremoniously sort of ejected from the office and replaced by someone else. The only consistent force was Donald Trump.
The inconsistency is the consistency. Yes. I mean, so that brings us back to the question of leverage, which you've mentioned a couple of times. And I suppose the issue here is how effectively can countries stand up to him? Because I guess the early example, kind of the only example we've seen so far really was with Mexico and Canada, where he announced the tariffs over a weekend. On the Friday, he was saying there is no negotiating on this; it's economic. Over the weekend, he was saying, he was sort of sending messages on social media saying there may be some pain, but it's going to be great. And by Monday, he was basically delaying them by a month and saying, well, the Mexican president and the Canadian prime minister have promised to send some troops to the border and appoint a fentanyl czar, and actually, that's all great. So, is there a sense here that maybe the countries can stand up to him?
I suppose in terms of standing up to him. I suppose my question is, which countries are able to actually inflict economic pain on the United States?
Mm.
And the answer is, the answer isn't zero. As in that you could think there are certain things China could do, there are certain things the EU could do, there's certain things Mexico and Canada can do because of how heavily integrated they are into the US economy, which means that when they respond saying, for example, we're going to consider cutting off your energy supplies, which is one of the things that sort of mumbled up through the Canadian discourse, that sort of markets and therefore the president does have to take it seriously. But for lots of countries, it's quite difficult to argue anything they could do by themselves would inflict significant pain on the US. They could, for example, as we've seen previously, impose new duties on sort of headline US products such as Harley Davidson's, oranges from Florida, the sort of things that have some political salience. But in terms of actually damaging the US economy or getting them to go, oh, I'm not sure about that, it's difficult. So I think the answer is that for most countries, if you wanted to stand up to him and say, we're not going to accept you doing that, and if you do it, we're going to strike back and it's going to be damaging for you, you're going to need to do it collectively. You would actually need sort of, if we pick some middle powers, UK, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, you can throw Mexico into that, Brazil. If everyone said, if you do this, say the universal tariff on steel and aluminium, we're going to respond by imposing new tariffs on these products and new restrictions on certain investment or the like. But the problem is, because everyone knows he can be bargained with, creating that united front is incredibly difficult because it just takes one of them to go, oh, actually, I reckon I can talk my way out of this. For example, Modi, just after Trump announcing the reciprocal tariffs, Modi's there going, well, we could probably do a deal here. We could reduce some of our duties. Yeah. So the incentive for collective action, I'm just not sure is quite there. And in a way, that's the point. By creating this uncertainty, you mentioned earlier the sort of perpetual uncertainty surrounding Trump, that's deliberate. Whether he means it or not, it has an impact on how everyone interacts with him, because we could all stand up with him, or, maybe we'll be all right. Yeah.
We'll arrange a royal visit and then, kind of...
Right. And also there's an advantage. So if you're really gaming this out, there is an advantage to a single country to getting an exemption in a context in which everyone else does not. So say, for example, if you're Japan and your exports to the US are exempted from any new trade measures, or if not exempted, at least are treated better, not only do your exporters retain competitiveness in the US against domestic producers, you also gain competitiveness versus everyone else.
Yes.
Insofar as if you compared to, say, a UK exporter or a South Korean exporter, so you're potentially in even a better situation than you were before. So actually aligning incentives is difficult. I mean, and it's not unique to this situation. I just think it's more pronounced.
Yeah, I mean, there is another question mark, I think, in terms of leverage, which is the stock market, right? I mean, there is this view, fairly widely held view, that the stock market is an important gauge here. I had the chairman of one big bank say to me recently, Trump's main key performance indicator is the S&P 500 index. And I mean, that may or may not be right, but I guess that is a question we haven't really sort of tested yet. We had on the Monday after they announced the tariffs on Mexico and Canada, there was a bit of a market reaction, although not as large as you might expect if they were really being implemented. And since then, everything else obviously is still kind of, it's slightly in this phony war stage. So I guess that's one of the pressure point that potentially we'd have to see, like if there was a serious stock market sell-off, would that change his behavior?
I think of the different avenues to change his behavior, it's the most convincing in terms of the arguments made. It's something he actually cares about. As you said, he sort of views it as a key performance indicator of his presidency. So if there is an extreme adverse reaction, it is plausible that it could lead him to change course. The other route people mention is the courts. So legal challenges to his interventions, given most of them take the form of executive orders.
Right.
And I'm just less convinced by that, insofar as if it does have an impact, it will probably take a little while. And even if a ruling does go against him, as evidenced by the last couple of months, he might ignore it, or he might do something else, or the like. So I think that's right. On the you didn't use the word complacency, but I think there is a complacency point around the sort of stock market reaction. Insofar, you're right, there was that initial reaction following the Canada and Mexico announcements, but since then it seems that everyone's sort of factored in this idea that he's always bluffing, that everything's about leverage and negotiation, and there'll be an agreed outcome. And I think the point I would make, and one of the lessons from last time, is that sometimes he does just do it. A negotiation fails and he does impose new tariffs that you weren't necessarily expecting. And also one of the points from them, everyone talks about that weekend, the Mexico-Canada discussion. They forget that he did impose an additional 10% tariff on China.
Yeah.
So there are new tariffs. And one of the fallouts from that actually was slightly unexpected to, I think, wider audiences, because within the executive order, it also removed something called the de minimis tariff treatment of low-value packages. So the US doesn't apply tariffs to packages sold business to consumer valued at below $800. And he removed that treatment of packages coming from China.
And then suspended
it unleashed chaos at the border, because all of a sudden you have all of these Temu Shein packages arriving, and they're stopping to look at all of them. And the reason these de minimis thresholds exist is because the actual enforcement costs also often outweigh the cost the revenue that you might claim. So he since then had to suspend this because it unleashed too much chaos. But that happened, and for certain companies, that created a huge problem.
Yeah.
So I think, we can't be complacent. I think, and at some point, maybe he doesn't like the fact that people are talking about the fact he can be bought off. He's easy to negotiate with. Everyone keeps being let off, and he just hits someone pretty hard because he wants to, and he can.
Yeah. So there's a couple of things I just want to get your views on. The first is the EU, because it does seem like this whole question of sort of reciprocal tariffs, and particularly that idea of if you've got a value-added tax in your country, we're going to basically view that as equivalent to a tax on Americans, and we'll differentiate between different countries. I mean, the EU obviously negotiates collectively on trade deals, but it sounds like here the plan is, or at least the possibility is, to have sort of specific tariffs on specific EU countries, depending on whether he likes them or not. And I just wonder how that might play out and how the EU could respond to that.
So I think this is a really big risk that I don't, my view is it doesn't get spoken about enough, which is that within the EU legal construct, it is true that there is something called the Common Commercial Policy, which means that the European Commission has competence for negotiating on trade externally. But the EU can't tell the US to treat it as the EU. The US could quite easily decide it wants to treat different member states differently for the purpose of tariffs or for the purpose of other interventions. And going back to the beginning of the discussion, the fact that Trump has broadened out his sort of assessment of what is considered unfair trade practices to include things like VAT, where there are differential levels throughout the EU. I mean, it's within a small range, but some countries might have 19, others might have 20, others might have 21 or higher. So, but that does create some differentiation. You also then have on digital services taxes, another issue raised by Trump. So some member states have it and some member states don't. France, Austria, Spain, Italy have digital services taxes or have been discussing them. Other member states don't. So what you could have is Trump imposing specific tariffs at specific rates to individual member states. And within that, it's also possible he exempts specific member states. So say, for example, he has a good relationship with Orban in Hungary, or he's getting on with Italy particularly well at that moment in time. He could say, well, I'm going to apply tariffs to France, Germany, and Denmark, and I'm not going to apply tariffs to these other member states. And the reason this is such a challenge is it makes a unified EU response much more difficult, because in terms of, going again back to one of our early discussions, could the EU hit back in a way that hurts the US and hurts US companies? Yes. It could do. It could impose tariffs on certain products at a level where they become uncompetitive in the EU. It could start using one of its new instruments, the anti-coercion instrument, penalizing US services companies. It could go after big tech more. It could do a lot. But will there be universal agreement to pursue that route if some countries are doing just fine? And they don't actually want to provoke Trump anymore or elicit a stronger response. You also have, for example, even the discussion around Greenland.
Right.
So Trump wants Greenland and he's threatening Denmark with tariffs if they don't give it to him. How do you respond to that as the EU? Because it is entirely possible that he could just put tariffs on products leaving Denmark and leave everyone else untouched.
Yes, so sort of drive a wedge between them. I mean, I guess it's also, just because of the way the EU operates in terms of laws and rules and so forth, it's also quite hard for them to do something really nakedly transactional, right? It's not possible for them to do the equivalent of what the Mexicans did and said, oh, well, don't worry, we'll just send some troops to the border. They don't have the EU doesn't necessarily have the ability to kind of to pull all those levers.
So it doesn't have the ability necessarily to do it, but it does have the ability to say it's going to do it. Right. And so this brings me back to an example from last time. So I sometimes refer to it as the Juncker gambit. So Donald Trump was threatening the EU with tariffs on cars. So Jean-Claude Juncker went to see him and said,
who was then the head of the Commission, right? who was then
the president of the European Commission, and said, don't do this because I'm going to solve one of your issues. The EU is going to buy more LNG and soybeans from you. And Trump went, great, no need for tariffs on cars. Jean-Claude Juncker had no power to dictate on a sort of central purchasing type arrangement of LNG and soya. He just looked at a chart and noticed it was ticking upwards.
Right.
So going to your Mexico and Canada examples, you could argue they already had those troops on the border. And it's definitely on the Mexican. Yeah. So the EU still has some room to play with in that it can commit to do things it might be doing anyway, or at least are plausibly believable, and assume that he's not fully across the respective competence of the European Commission versus member states. But you're right, it is trickier. And even one of the sort of things that we think the EU is going to offer the US is to buy more defense equipment, given that everyone's going to be spending more on defense and the like. Even that is actually quite difficult from a domestic politics point of view, because the French don't want that to happen. Yeah. They're saying, well, no, we need to create domestic capabilities and we don't want to be reliant on the US. So even something as simple as going out to the US and saying, we're going to buy more defense equipment, knowing that's going to happen anyway, so you can commit to it, gets undermined by a French politician standing up and saying, actually, we don't want that to happen.
Yeah. Well, and after the last week or so, maybe they don't want to be as dependent on US equipment. But sorry, just to wrap this up. But one final question I just want to get a little bit is just the sort of your assessment of the kind of the broader state of the global trade system. You put your Substack newsletter you put out the other day. The headline the newsletter is called "Most Favored Nation," and you basically said most favored nation is dead, right? And we have killed it. So obviously the kind of the WTO kind of multilateral global system has been on life support for some time. I guess I just wonder sort of how big a sort of breach is what the US is doing now, and to what extent does that mean that other countries will be less likely or willing to deal with each other on a multilateral basis in the future?
I think you're right. It's a continuation of a trend in which the US under Biden, Trump before him, and Obama before, to be honest, have been undermining the WTO via different routes. But I suppose the point I would make is that up until now, if you just remove the US from the equation, in terms of the day-to-day functioning of the WTO, for everyone else, it's still been kind of working, insofar as China and the EU could have a dispute between each other, Indonesia and the EU, and it can go through a system that people had worked out workarounds, and it was semi-functioning. I think the challenge posed by the sort of new Trump measures is he's sort of provoking countries into taking actions that very explicitly breach their WTO commitments. So going back to the intro to this question, So this concept of most favored nation is this principle that's embedded in the WTO system that essentially says that you will treat all other members equally. So if I were to reduce my tariffs by 10%, that would apply to all other members. I wouldn't just do that for one specific country. There are obviously caveats to this, otherwise free trade agreements wouldn't exist, but that's the basic principle. But in the context of the threats Trump's making in relation to reciprocal tariffs, where he's saying, well, if you don't want a 10% tariff, lower your tariff to the same level as ours. So for example, on cars with the EU, he's saying our tariff is 2.5%, yours is 10, lower it to 2.5 and we don't have a problem. The EU has a decision to make there, which is, does it lower it, if it does want to do this, does it lower its tariff to 2.5% and apply that to everyone,
right,
as it's supposed to do on the basis of its international obligations and its commitments under numerous WTO agreements?
So China, Japan, everybody else.
Exactly.
Right?
Or does it just do it to the US? And if it decides it just wants to do it to the US, the legal route to achieve this is via a free trade agreement, but that would take too long and it'd probably be too difficult. So your other options are, do I come up with a bit of a wheeze, a partial agreement that's maybe not WTO compliant, but maybe it's compliant enough that I can argue the case? Do I create a new product code for US specific cars where I've technically lowered it for everyone, but it only actually applies to those cars? And the EU actually has done this before in relation to US lobsters. It did it in Trump 1 when it reduced tariffs universally, but in reality only to lobsters sourced from the US. Or do I just say, actually, I don't care about my obligations, I'm going to reduce tariffs for the US and everyone else can work it out? And different countries will take different approaches. I think, so it's going to put this idea of, I suppose, treating everyone the same under much, much greater strain.
That's great, Sam. I have to say, one thing I've taken away from this conversation is, and which I didn't know before, is you seem to spend a lot of time thinking about seafood, right? We were talking earlier about
shellfish, lobsters,
EU shrimps, and then American lobsters. So maybe one day we can tell the whole story of global trade through seafood or something.
Yeah, it's amazing how many trade disputes come back to fishing.
But this has been really great. Thank you so much for taking the time to go through all this and hopefully it's definitely helped me clarify some of these issues. So so much appreciated, and thanks for your time. And we'll no doubt be talking about this again in the future.
Thanks for having me.
That's all we have time for this week. This podcast was produced by Oliver Tazic in London. You can listen to a new episode of The Big View every Tuesday on the Reuters app or your favorite platform. And don't forget to tune in to our sister podcast, Viewsroom, every Thursday, as well as other great podcasts from the Reuters team. If you liked what you heard, please follow The Big View and let us know what you thought. And check out our views on the biggest stories in business and finance every day at breakingviews.com and reuters.com.